Good afternoon, fifth grade, and welcome to the end of your year. You've been learning all about Greek mythology here in your final block of fifth grade, and I wanted to share a video lesson with you to help you conclude your year and also to prepare us for next year in sixth grade, because we're going to return first thing back to Greece, and we're going to take things out of Greek mythology that you've been learning about and start to look at Greek history, and in fact the history that will influence Rome, which of course will be one of our first blocks of the sixth grade. Now, I chose today to give you a lesson about geography, because we can't really understand a people or their history without understanding the land that they lived on. Now, when we think about the Greek people and we think about the history that they had, it's important to understand what was life like for them back in the ancient times, and how did the geography of their world influence who they were? So I've made for you a map that kind of encompasses a lot of the different events and stories of ancient Greece so that we could have a look at what were things like for these very important people in history. Well, to begin with, when we think about Greece, we are thinking about a world that is in the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea is a large body of water that has Europe to the north, it has Asia to the west, and it has Africa to the south. So these three continents all meet together around the Mediterranean Sea. Now, as we can see from the map here, the Greeks lived in a smaller part of the sea called the Aegean Sea. When we look at a map of Greece, we can quickly see that the Greek people were very much water-based people. You can see that most of Greece is either these huge numbers of islands, or the land areas, of course, were filled with peninsulas and areas that reached out into the ocean. If we look at this map, we can see that most of the Greeks lived not too far from the sea. This meant that the Greeks were very much a traveling sort of people, and boats were incredibly important, boats and ships. Now, some of the key stories of ancient Greece that we can think about when we're looking at a map like this is the rise of these city-states. If you had gone to the pentathlon, which I'm very sorry that you missed, we would have split up into 4 different city-states. And so on this map, I've included the 4 big city-states that existed in ancient Greece. Now, of course, ancient Greece did not call themselves Greeks. In fact, even today, the Greeks call their land Hellas, H-E-L-L-A-S. And so Greece is kind of a foreign name that is put on this whole area. But in ancient times, all of this land was divided into many different small kingdoms. And even within these small kingdoms, there was a rise of city-states, meaning a city and the region around it, and the city would control that whole area. Oftentimes, these city-states were at war with one another and constantly battling for territory and prestige. Maybe the most famous of these city-states, and the one that is still the capital of the country of Greece today, is right here, and it's called Athens. Athens we think about as having the beautiful building of the Parthenon. Athens was the center of philosophy, a huge amount of science, of mathematics, of geometry. There are a lot of things that were happening in Athens. The Athenians were a very powerful people, and as you hear, they put a lot of value into their intellect and their way of thinking. Now, as we travel up this little area of land, we get to the Thebes, the city of Thebes. And the Thebans have quite a few stories that we can remember from ancient Greek mythology. Not too far from Thebes is the city of Delphi. Now, Delphi was really important in ancient Greek mythology because at Delphi there was a cave, and in this cave there was a lot of different steam coming out of the earth. Very much like when we go over to Pune and we go into the steam vents, it's a place where geological activity resulted in a bunch of internal gases being released through a cave. Well, in ancient Greece, there was always priestesses who would go there, and they would go into these caves and breathe these gases. And when they came out, they would have visions. And so Delphi became a place that was known as the Oracle of Delphi. In that oracle, people would give prophecies and visions and tell kings and queens and all the powerful people what might be happening in the future. Now, if we go south of Delphi, we see that in this little strip of land, at the side of it, we have a city of Corinth. And the Corinthians were a whole nother city-state of people. They would give us things like the Corinthian column, which, as we learn about Greek architecture, was one of the different types of columns they used to build with. If we go south here, we can see the city of Argos. Argos was the home port of Jason and the Argonauts. And out of there, Jason sailed forth with his ship and his adventurous sailors, and they traveled all around this region, giving many great stories of Jason and the Argonauts seeking out the golden fleece. If we go down from Argos, down to this lower part of this peninsula called the Peloponnesus, we have the city of Sparta. Sparta was very famous in ancient Greece for being a very strong militaristic society in which they trained their people to be incredibly powerful warriors, very, very disciplined. It was said that Sparta had no walls because the walls of Sparta were its soldiers. The Spartans would be famous especially because at one point, when all of this territory was being invaded by the Persian Empire, when the Persians came all the way down and were marching their way to attack Athens, a group of 300 Spartans met them at a place called Thermopylae. And at Thermopylae, these brave Spartans, under King Leonidas, fought to the very end, to the very last man, in order to stop a giant army and prevent them from moving down, or at least give the rest of the Greeks time to be ready for the invasion. Now up here, in this more northern part of Greece, we have a very important mountain. Mount Olympus was a real place in Greece. And of course, the Greeks believed that at the top of this very tall mountain were all of their gods and goddesses. So Mount Olympus was a real place that had this vision for all the Greek people, that that's where their gods and goddesses dwelt. Over here in this part of Greece, we have a bunch of small islands, one of which was called Ithaca. There's a city in New York named Ithaca, but the original Ithaca was the home of a very, very famous Greek sailor. Now, back in the ancient days of Greece, there was a story about a beautiful woman, and her name was Helen. Helen was married to the king of Sparta, but they weren't very close. Now, at one point in time, a man from a distant land, a distant large and powerful city called Troy, sailed on a mission down to meet with Sparta. This young man's name was Paris. He was a prince of Troy. And when Paris met Helen in Sparta, they fell deeply in love. Paris took Helen and stole her away from Sparta and the king of Sparta and took her all the way back to Troy. It was said from that experience that Helen, so beautiful that her face launched 1,000 ships. For Helen, after being brought to Troy, was the reason that they began the Iliad, one of the great stories of ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks wrote about the idea that after Helen had been taken back to Troy, the Greek kingdoms united together and sent their thousands of ships off to conquer Troy. Their assault of Troy would, of course, take 10 years, and by the end of this 10-year siege of the city of Troy, the Greeks tricked the Trojans by saying that we are leaving, we're giving up, we're not going to attack you anymore, but we just happen to be leaving behind a giant wooden horse as an offering to the gods before we sail home to Greece. Well, of course, the famous story tells us that inside this Trojan horse was a bunch of Greek soldiers. And these Greek soldiers, when brought into the city in the giant wooden horse, were able to break out at night, open the city gates, and bring in the returning Greek army who destroyed the city of Troy. With the fall of Troy, those Greeks were finally able to go back home. But one of the very famous people, in fact, one of the ones who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse, was a man named Odysseus. And Odysseus had to make an incredibly long journey back to his home that ends up taking him another 10 years and takes him on adventures all throughout this entire region. The story of Odysseus' journey from Troy all the way back home to Ithaca is the story of the Odyssey, another of the great legends of Greek history. Down here we see the island of Crete, and a lot of the influence of ancient Greece came from Crete, which developed before any of this area grew and became powerful and knowledgeable. Down in the island of Crete, of course, we had the story of King Minos and his Minotaur who was locked inside the labyrinth. Crete would influence Greece, and eventually, near the end, with Greek philosophy, the third of the great philosophers of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Aristotle, the last of these, would eventually be taken up north to the land of Macedonia. And in the land of Macedonia, Aristotle would train a young prince, and this young prince had a destiny to take over not only all of Greece, but much of the known world at the time. And this young prince will be one of our great focal points as we begin the 6th grade, because he will take us on this journey in which we will go back through many of the cultures that you have already learned about. This young man's name was Alexander, and after conquering all the land that he conquered, he would be known as Alexander the Great. I look forward to taking you guys back into Greece in the fall and teaching you all about these wonderful stories of this great area. Hope you have a wonderful summer.